There was an old woman gossiping in the kitchen, and the blinds were sucked in and out by the breeze. All was blowing, all was growing, and over all those plates and bowls and tall, brandishing red and yellow flowers, a very thin yellow veil would be drawn. Like a vine leaf at night, things became stiller and darker at night, but the leaf-like veil was so fine that lights lifted it, voices crinkled it. He could see through it a figure stooping, here, coming close, going away, some dress rustling, some chain tinkling. It was in this world that the wheel went over the person's foot. Something he remembered stayed and darkened over him, would not move. Something flourished up in the air. Something arid and sharp descended even there like a blade, a scimitar, smiting through the leaves and flowers, even of that happy world, and making it shrivel and fall. It will rain, he remembered his father saying. You won't be able to go to the lighthouse. The lighthouse was then a silvery, misty-looking tower with a yellow eye that opened suddenly and softly in the evening. Now, James looked at the lighthouse. He could see the whitewashed rocks, the tower stark and straight. He could see that it was barred with black and white. He could see windows in it. He could even see washing spread on the rocks to dry. So that was the lighthouse, was it? No, the other was also the lighthouse, for nothing was simply one thing. The other lighthouse was true, too. It was sometimes hardly to be seen across the bay. In the evening one looked up and saw the eye opening and shutting, and the light seemed to reach them in that airy, sunny garden where they sat. But he pulled himself up whenever he said they or a person, and then began hearing the rustle of someone coming, the tinkle of someone going. He became extremely sensitive to the presence of whoever might be in the room. It was his father now. The strain was acute. For in one moment, if there was no breeze, his father would slap the covers of his book together and say, "What's happening now? What are we dawdling about here for, eh?" As once before he had brought his blade down among them on the terrace, and she had gone stiff all over. And if there had been an axe handy, a knife, or anything with a sharp point, he would have seized it and struck his father through the heart. She had gone stiff all over, and then her arm slackening so that he felt she listened to him no longer. She had risen somehow and gone away and left him there, impotent, ridiculous, sitting on the floor, grasping a pair of scissors. Not a breath of wind blew. The water chuckled and gurgled in the bottom of the boat, where 3 or 4 mackerel beat their tails up and down in a pool of water not deep enough to cover them. At any moment, Mr. Ramsay, he scarcely dared look at him, might rouse himself, shut his book, and say something sharp. But for the moment he was reading, so that James stealthily, as if he were stealing downstairs on bare feet, afraid of waking a watchdog by a creaking board, went on thinking, what was she like? Where did she go that day? He began following her from room to room, and at last they came to a room where, in a blue light, as if the reflection came from many china dishes, she talked to somebody. He listened to her talking. She talked to a servant, saying simply whatever came into her head. She alone spoke the truth. To her alone could he speak it. That was the source of her everlasting attraction for him, perhaps. She was a person to whom one could say what came into one's head. But all the time he thought of her, he was conscious of his father following his thought, surveying it, making it shiver and falter. At last he ceased to think. There he sat with his hand on the tiller in the sun, staring at the lighthouse, powerless to move, powerless to flick off these grains of misery, which settled on his mind one after another. A rope seemed to bind him there, and his father had knotted it, and he could only escape by taking a knife and plunging it. But at that moment the sail swung slowly round, filled slowly out. The boat seemed to shake herself, and then to move off, half conscious in her sleep, and then she woke and shot through the waves. The relief was extraordinary. They all seemed to fall away from each other again and to be at their ease, and the fishing lines slanted taut across the side of the boat. But his father did not rouse himself. He only raised his right hand mysteriously high in the air and let it fall upon his knee again as if he were conducting some secret symphony. The sea without a stain on it, thought Lily Briscoe, still standing and looking out over the bay. The sea stretched like silk across the bay. Distance had an extraordinary power. They had been swallowed up in it, she felt. They were gone forever. They had become part of the nature of things. It was so calm. It was so quiet. The steamer itself had vanished, but the great scroll of smoke still hung in the air and drooped like a flag mournfully in valediction. It was like that then, the island, thought Cam, once more drawing her fingers through the waves. She had never seen it from out at sea before. It lay like that on the sea, did it, with a dent in the middle and two sharp crags, and the sea swept in there and spread away for miles and miles on either side of the island. It was very small, shaped something like a leaf stood on end. So we took a little boat, she thought, beginning to tell herself a story of adventure about escaping from a sinking ship. But with the sea streaming through her fingers, a spray of seaweed vanishing behind them, she did not want to tell herself seriously a story. It was the sense of adventure and escape that she wanted, for she was thinking, as the boat sailed on, how her father's anger about the points of the compass, James' obstinacy about the compact, and her own anguish. All had slipped, all had passed, all had streamed away. What then came next? Where were they going? From her hand, ice cold, held deep in the sea, there spurted up a fountain of joy at the change, at the escape, at the adventure, that she should be alive, that she should be there. And the drops falling from this sudden and unthinking fountain of joy fell here and there on the dark, the slumbrous shapes in her mind, shapes of a world not realized but turning in their darkness, catching here and there a spark of light. Greece, Rome, Constantinople. Small as it was and shaped something like a leaf stood on its end with the gold-sprinkled waters flowing in and about it. It had, she supposed, a place in the universe, even that little island. The old gentleman in the study, she thought, could have told her. Sometimes she strayed in from the garden purposely to catch them at it. There they were. It might be Mr. Carmichael or Mr. Banks, who was sitting with her father. Sitting opposite each other in their low armchairs, they were crackling in front of them the pages of the Times. When she came in from the garden, all in a muddle about something someone had said about Christ, or hearing that a mammoth had been dug up in a London street, or wondering what Napoleon was like. Then they took all this with their clean hands. They wore gray-colored clothes, they smelt of heather, and they brushed the scraps together, turning the paper, crossing their knees, and said something now and then very brief. Just to please herself, she would take a book from the shelf and stand there, watching her father write so equally, so neatly from one side of the page to another, with a little cough now and then or something said briefly to the other old gentleman opposite. And she thought, standing there with her book open, one could let whatever one thought expand here like a leaf in water. And if it did well here among the old gentlemen smoking and the Times crackling, then it was right. And watching her father as he wrote in his study, she thought, now sitting in the boat, he was not vain nor a tyrant and did not wish to make you pity him. Indeed, if he saw she was there reading a book, he would ask her as gently as anyone could, was there nothing he could give her? Lest this should be wrong, she looked at him reading the little book with the shiny cover, mottled like a plover's egg. No, it was right. Look at him now, she wanted to say aloud to James, but James had his eye on the sail. He is a sarcastic brute, James would say. He brings the talk round to himself in his books, James would say. He is intolerably egotistical. Worst of all, he is a tyrant. But look, she said, looking at him. Look at him now. She looked at him reading the little book with his legs curled, the little book whose yellowish pages she knew without knowing what was written on them. It was small. It was closely printed on the flyleaf. She knew he had written that he had spent 15 francs on dinner. The wine had been so much. He had given so much to the waiter. All was added up neatly at the bottom of the page. But what might be written in the book which had rounded its edges off in his pocket, she did not know. What he thought they none of them knew. But he was absorbed in it, so that when he looked up, as he did now for an instant, it was not to see anything. It was to pin down some thought more exactly. That done, his mind flew back again, and he plunged into his reading. He read, she thought, as if he were guiding something, or wheedling a large flock of sheep, or pushing his way up and up a single narrow path. And sometimes he went fast and straight and broke his way through the bramble, and sometimes it seemed a branch struck at him, a bramble blinded him, but he was not going to let himself be beaten by that. On he went, tossing over page after page. And she went on telling herself a story about escaping from a sinking ship, for she was safe while he sat there. Safe, as she felt herself when she crept in from the garden and took a book down, and the old gentleman, lowering the paper suddenly, said something very brief over the top of it about the character of Napoleon. She gazed back over the sea at the island, but the leaf was losing its sharpness. It was very small, it was very distant. The sea was more important now than the shore. Waves were all round them, tossing and sinking, with a log wallowing down one wave, a gull riding on another. About here, she thought, dabbling her fingers in the water, a ship had sunk, and she murmured, dreamily half asleep, how we perished, each alone. So much depends, then, thought Lily Briscoe, looking at the sea, which had scarcely a stain on it, which was so soft that the sails and the clouds seemed set in its blue. So much depends, she thought, upon distance, whether people are near us or far from us, for her feeling for Mr. Ramsay changed as he sailed further and further across the bay. It seemed to be elongated, stretched out. He seemed to become more and more remote. He and his children seemed to be swallowed up in that blue, that distance. But here on the lawn, close at hand, Mr. Carmichael suddenly grunted. She laughed. He clawed his book up from the grass. He settled into his chair again, puffing and blowing like some sea monster. That was different altogether because he was so near. And now again all was quiet. They must be out of bed by this time, she supposed, looking at the house, but nothing appeared there. But then she remembered they had always made off directly a meal was over on business of their own. It was all in keeping with this silence, this emptiness, and the unreality of the early morning hour. It was a way things had sometimes, she thought, lingering for a moment and looking at the long glittering windows and the plume of blue smoke, they became unreal. So coming back from a journey or after an illness before habits had spun themselves across the surface, one felt that same unreality which was so startling, felt something emerge. Life was most vivid then. One could be at one's ease. Mercifully, one need not say very briskly, crossing the lawn to greet old Mrs. Beckwith, who would be coming out to find a corner to sit in. "Oh, good morning, Mrs. Beckwith. What a lovely day. Are you going to be so bold as to sit in the sun? Jasper's hidden the chairs. Do let me find you one." And all the rest of the usual chatter. One need not speak at all. One glided, one shook one's sails. There was a good deal of movement in the bay. Boats were starting off between things, beyond things. Empty it was not, but full to the brim. She seemed to be standing up to the lips in some substance, to move and float and sink in it, yes. For these waters were unfathomably deep. Into them had spilled so many lives. The Ramseys, the children's, and all sorts of waifs and strays of things besides. A washerwoman with her basket, a rook, a red-hot poker, the purples and gray-greens of flowers, some common feeling held the whole. It was some such feeling of completeness, perhaps, which 10 years ago, standing almost where she stood now, had made her say that she must be in love with the place. Love had 1,000 shapes. There might be lovers whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so, giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, make of some scene or meeting of people all now gone and separate, one of those globed, compacted things over which thought lingers and love plays. Her eyes rested on the brown speck of Mr. Ramsay's sailing boat. They would be at the lighthouse by lunchtime, she supposed, but the wind had freshened, and as the sky changed slightly and the sea changed slightly and the boats altered their positions, the view, which a moment before had seemed miraculously fixed, was now unsatisfactory. The wind had blown the trail of smoke about. There was something displeasing about the placing of the ships. The disproportion there seemed to upset some harmony in her own mind. She felt an obscure distress. It was confirmed when she turned to her picture. She had been wasting her morning. For whatever reason, she could not achieve that razor edge of balance between two opposite forces. Mr. Ramsay and the picture, which was necessary. There was something perhaps wrong with the design. Was it, she wondered, that the line of the wall wanted breaking? Was it that the mass of the trees was too heavy? She smiled ironically, for had she not thought, when she began, that she had solved her problem? What was the problem then? She must try to get hold of something that evaded her. It evaded her when she thought of Mrs. Ramsay. It evaded her now when she thought of her picture. Phrases came, visions came, beautiful pictures, beautiful phrases, but what she wished to get hold of was that very jar on the nerves, the thing itself before it has been made anything. Get that and start afresh, she said desperately, pitching herself firmly again before her easel. It was a miserable machine, an inefficient machine, she thought, the human apparatus for painting or feeling. It always broke down at the critical moment. Heroically, one must force it on. She stared, frowning. There was the head, sure enough. But one got nothing by soliciting urgently. One got only a glare in the eye from looking at the line of the wall or from thinking she wore a gray hat. She was astonishingly beautiful. Let it come, she thought, if it will come. For there are moments when one can neither think nor feel, and if one can neither think nor feel, she thought, where is one? Here on the grass, on the ground, she thought, sitting down and examining with her brush a little colony of plantains, for the lawn was very rough. Here sitting on the world, she thought, for she could not shake herself free from the sense that everything this morning was happening for the first time, perhaps for the last time, as a traveler, even though he is half asleep, knows, looking out of the train window, that he must look now, for he will never see that town, or that mule cart, or that woman at work in the fields again. The lawn was the world. They were up here together on this exalted station, she thought, looking at old Mr. Carmichael, who seemed, though they had not said a word all this time, to share her thoughts. And she would never see him again, perhaps. He was growing old. Also, she remembered, smiling at the slipper that dangled from his foot. He was growing famous. People said that his poetry was so beautiful. They went and published things he had written 40 years ago. There was a famous man now called Carmichael, she smiled, thinking how many shapes one person might wear, how he was that in newspapers, but here the same as he had always been. He looked the same, grayer rather. Yes, he looked the same, but somebody had said, she recalled, that when he had heard of Andrew Ramsay's death, he was killed in a second by a shell. He should have been a great mathematician. Mr. Carmichael had, quote, lost all interest in life, end of quote. What did it mean, that? She wondered, had he marched through Trafalgar Square grasping a big stick? Had he turned pages over and over without reading them, sitting in his room in St. John's Wood alone? She did not know what he had done when he heard that Andrew was killed, but she felt it in him all the same. They only mumbled at each other on staircases. They looked up at the sky and said, it will be fine, or it won't be fine. But this was one way of knowing people, she thought, to know the outline, not the detail, to sit in one's garden and look at the slopes of a hill running purple down into the distant heather. She knew him in that way. She knew that he had changed somehow. She had never read a line of his poetry. She thought that she knew how it went, though, slowly and sonorously. It was seasoned and mellow. It was about the desert and the camel. It was about the palm tree and the sunset. It was extremely impersonal. It said something about death. It said very little about love. There was an impersonality about him. He wanted very little of other people. Had he not always lurched rather awkwardly past the drawing-room window with some newspaper under his arm, trying to avoid Mrs. Ramsay, whom for some reason he did not much like? On that account, of course, she would always try to make him stop. He would bow to her. He would halt unwillingly and bow profoundly. Annoyed that he did not want anything of her, Mrs. Ramsay would ask him. Lily could hear her. Wouldn't he like a coat or a rug, a newspaper? No, he wanted nothing. Here he bowed. There was some quality in her which he did not much like. It was perhaps her masterfulness, her positiveness, something matter-of-fact in her. She was so direct.